All right, I think we can get started here. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our meeting here today on navigating the AI regulatory landscape. My name is George Halim with Thomas Regulatory Consultant Group. As many of all you know, we provide quality and regulatory expertise for the digital med tech space. As I mentioned, I'm George Halim. I am one of the staff members. I've been in quality for about 15 years. Background started in the pharma world, in manufacturing, and then leaned into quality and regulatory. I've been doing that for the last 12 to 15 years on the medical device side, and more recently heading the quality of a medical device for imaging. And I'd like to introduce our president and our host for today, Khalil Thomas. Khalil comes with 20 years of a QMS experience. He's done a lot here, 10 years owning global quality systems with MedTech Big Six, 10 years with software, clinical decision support, AI technology. He's also been a security and a privacy officer at various points in career, and then also former head of quality for the corp audit for one of the MedTech Big Six.
I get the pleasure of introducing our guest, Dr. Ken Fu. Dr. Fu is a medical device and in vitro diagnostics subject matter expert for the medical device software, AI ML enabled medical devices, cybersecurity, and he's also a senior product reviewer for TÜV SÜD. Ken is authorized and is an EU MDR and IVDR technical document assessor, and in his capacity with TÜV, he's assessed dozens of technical dossiers, the majority of which he served in the role of expert for the assessment of medical device software and AI, ML, artificial intelligence, machine learning, I should probably say that, enabled devices. Dr. Fu is a SAS certified machine learning expert and was recently invited to share his expertise to a standing room only session at RAPS entitled Regulatory Framework of AI ML Enabled Medical Devices in the US and EU. And with that, welcome, Dr. Fu.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great to have you.
So I first question for you, Ken, is a little bit of a weird space to be the subject matter expert and giving these kinds of presentations. Can you give us just how did you get into this space, and then from where you sit today, kind of give us a general overview of how you see the space, what's going on, what can we learn?
Right. So I'm a biomedical engineer by training, and I did have some startup experience in the IVD space as a manufacturer, in which case I led the design and development as well as deployment of an IVD for breast cancer detection. They actually had a software component for which AI was a big part of it. So we were successful in leveraging some of the recent advances in the AI space to improve our ability to detect disease, and that was in the early 2010s. And as I mentioned, as a certified machine learning programmer, I was fascinated by the global regulatory efforts for these kinds of products, primarily because of how rapid the field was evolving. I joined TÜV SÜD as an organization as an IVD product assessment expert, and with that software experience, it was of particular interest to me to get authorized as a technical documentation assessor as well as a software expert. Over the years, I've gained more experience, and I'm one of two senior product specialists leading the AI and ML regulatory efforts within the organization. Regarding a general temperature check of the space, I think it's safe to give a brief overview of how we measure regulatory frameworks and regulating AI and ML enabled devices. First is the US, and I'm sure everyone knows of President Biden's executive order. That was released a few weeks ago, kind of setting the pace for more regulation that is expected to come out in the space. And then there's the EU, with the EU AI Act. They're currently in trial conversations. We hit a small roadblock last week, but we expect some more progress in the next few weeks. Finally, I see China as being a bit more advanced in terms of the number of guidance documents being released in the last 6 months. So for MedTech industry, when you look at these three regulatory regimes, there's a good understanding that a lot is happening and there's a lot of guidance expected in the next couple of years.
All right, thank you for that, Dr. Fu. Let's talk a little bit about the President Biden's executive order first. How do you see the impact of that change, and how do you see that interfacing with the EU AI Act that's pending later on this year, probably?
Yeah, President Biden's executive order is basically instructing the Department of Health as well as Human Services to develop, quote unquote, a safety program that targets detrimental or unsafe healthcare practices that are related to both AI and ML. I see this as a reactive move to what some of the other regulatory regimes around the world are doing. Speaking again in the case of the EU as well as China. I'm a big fan of the FDA in terms of leading the way with some proactive guidance for manufacturers over the last few years. The best for me so far is the concept of predetermined change control plan as well as good machine learning practices. But if you look at the EU AI Act and where we started in April 2021 and where the US is right now, I think the US is several steps behind in enacting appropriate regulatory frameworks for AI and ML devices. Of course, the FDA wants to be a leader. They have the capacity to be the leader, and the expectation is that they would be working very hard over the next few years, I would say, to catch up. In terms of how this affects the EU AI Act, I wouldn't say the two frameworks are interfering or intended to interfere with each other. Ideally, you want the different global regulatory frameworks for all industries to be complementary or quote unquote get to a point of convergence. And this is expected to be helpful to manufacturers so that they have a good level of clarity on how to prepare evidence to demonstrate safety and performance of their devices. One thing I must say as well is that a key consideration in establishing regulation for AI is that there's a lot of different people on the table with a lot of different views. They are working in each of these regulatory regimes to develop AI ML regulations, and they don't just represent the medtech industry, but they touch on other concerns of human lives, such as labor, education, gaming, and so on. And so, taking into consideration all these different industries, I see that as not being favorable to the medtech industry. But of course, China has shown that if you focus just on the medtech industry and don't take a globalized approach, then you would be more successful towards targeted regulation.
Thanks for that. That makes sense to me. You mentioned that there's a couple of different things going on but all these are kind of in the definition stage, right? From an enforcement standpoint, when do you see enforcement beginning, either for the EU AI Act or for some of the stuff that we saw spelled out in the EO? And what do you expect the enforcement to actually look like?
I would say enforcement in some jurisdictions are here and now. There's already enforcement happening in China. The EU notified bodies are already adjusting internal assessment procedures in preparation for the EU AI Act. Though it's got a transitional timeline, the expectation is that when they onboard new clients, they expect for them to be aware of the changes that are coming. The EU AI Act is expected to be law by Q1 of 2024, and so it's important that notified bodies are ahead of the curve there. The small wrinkle I talked about a few minutes ago about the EU AI Act, what happened last week. We see that being more political. The EU is coming towards an election cycle in the spring, and there's demands again. I think it's influenced by all these different industries, and not just on the medtech industry. The example that China's medical products administration have said, it seems to be popular among the regulatory decision makers. But I see it's a big challenge here for manufacturers. As an example, China's regulatory body published 4 different guidance documents in July of this year alone. And so you now start looking at there's enforcement already, but how do manufacturers technically keep up to that level of evolution in space?
Thank you for that. And assuming that all of these different things are broader, not assuming you mentioned that and touched on that earlier, that these are broadly across the AI space, they're not necessarily specific to medical devices. One, how does that risk classification, for instance, in the EU AI Act that says, hey, medical devices are already considered high risk, what does that mean for medical device manufacturers? And then a step forward, considering this is generic, what does this mean for health apps and personal health management tools, things that are not traditionally considered medical devices, but are still in this healthcare space?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, right? And when you look at the EU AI Act, first draft published April 2021, it's gone through about 377 amendments. What is currently in trial discussions now is starkly different from what was in the initial draft. But one thing remains the same is the classification approach, which is based on tier-based risk approach. And that risk-based approach is not based on categorization, it's based on a list. So by the fact that you have medical device, you already have risk. In terms of health apps or personal health management devices, the question is related to their intended purpose. So if they are defined as an IVD or as a medical device as per regulation MDR and IVDR, then they must be high risk. So all of this is in turn related to the intended purpose of the device. But it's very important for manufacturers to know that medical device is classified as high risk according to the EU AI Act. It's not by categorization, it's by listing.
Gotcha. Thank you. What are some key considerations when evaluating AI and machine learning enabled devices for the EU reg specifically? I know this is your bread and butter, and
Yeah, that's a loaded question. So the MDR and the IVDR, they have a common general safety and performance requirement that mandate devices that incorporate software or are software in themselves to be developed and manufactured in accordance with quote unquote state of the art. The expectation is that you should take into consideration the principles of development life cycle, risk management, including information security, verification, and validation. The key clause there is state of the art. And what we see as modified body is diverging interpretations of meaning of state of the art by manufacturers and regulators that are the modified bodies. As an example, think of a US-based company who would rate the MDR and the IVDR for the first time and interpret state of the art as perhaps meeting US FDA regulations. But this is not the case in the EU. Regarding software, you are looking at about 8 to 12 different standards and guidance documents, depending on the kind of device. And if AI is involved, there's even more. As an example, software lifecycle processes, you're looking at IEC 62304, the latest version, you're looking at IEC 82341. Look at risk management alone, it's 14971. In addition, if you've got an AI and ML component, just a few months ago, AMA published a consensus report together with PSI for 34971, which is a replication of 14971, but specifically in the context of AI. And so when you look, and I've not mentioned the guidance documents published by the EU Medical Device Coalition with MDC2. And so we can sit here and count up to a dozen different standards, but that is just one clause of the MDR and the IMG, which is state of the art requirements. And so taken together as a modified body, we group the different requirements into, say, 5 key considerations when we're evaluating these kinds of devices. So first, we look at the device description in light of AI. Other consideration there is the software safety classification according to IEC 62304. And why that is important because it sets the pace for demonstrating compliance to the other requirements, because depending on whether or not you use safety classification A, B, or C, some clauses in that lifecycle document will not be applicable. Next is the AI model. Check a look at how the data is trained, validated, or tested, together with the appropriateness of data segregation procedures demonstrated by the manufacturer. A good thing we look at the AI model as well is the representativeness of the different data sets to the actual population for which it's going to be deployed. One of the interesting examples I make in this space is you can't train a traffic model in California and deploy that in India. It's not just going to work. Then next is software lifecycle processes. Again, 62348 to 24-1. And then very important is risk management in light of the AI. We look at several aspects of which bias is of prime importance. As of now, again, I talked about the AMI report, which is 34971, that is considered state of the art. But who knows what state of the art will be in 6 months' time? Finally, there's an in-depth review of post-market surveillance activities, especially focusing on the risk of misuse of the device. I would like to mention as well that in this evaluation of the 5 different things I've just talked about, specific emphasis is made on whether or not the AI-enabled device is continually learning and the documentation support if that is the case. This is technically related to the US FDA's idea of a predetermined change control plan. But it focuses on specific funding management system requirements around version control, change control, as well as configuration infrastructure.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. So one, that was a lot. I got a couple follow-ups for you. So one of the things you mentioned is state of the art, and it occurred to me that since these regulations are kind of broad, they're not specific to medical devices, is that, we typically look to our competitors in the device space for what state of the art means. I don't know if this is fully fleshed out yet, but do you have any thoughts for us on how we're supposed to interpret state of the art? Am I looking at Google and Amazon now in addition to some of my device competitors, or how am I supposed to interpret that?
So of course, it's specific to a device, and the challenge there for most manufacturers is the niche in which your device is in. As a starting point, if you are engaged in designing and developing any software, then you should be seeking compliance to IEC 62304 as well as 82304-1. Risk management is properly documented as well. And if you are looking at placing a device in the EU marketplace and seeking either an MDR or MDR certification, then the MDCG guidance documents, you will need to demonstrate compliance to those. So I would say it depends on the intended purpose. It depends on a couple of things, but there are a few that I would say quote unquote applicable to nearly any software device out there.
Gotcha. Thank you. One of the other things you mentioned was the appropriateness of data sets. And, I nerd out and do a whole lot in the AI space. And some of the things that I see in headlines are, one, a little scary in terms of unintended consequences with algorithms and algorithm bias. Some of them are interesting. I live in New York City. There's a law now that says, hey, if you're an employer and you use an AI solution to screen resumes, you've got to have certain amount of testing and so on, so on, so on, to make sure that you're not inadvertently discriminating against people. So just curious, because this is a pretty new area for most of us, and just based off the headlines, it looks like we're all kind of falling flat on this. Can you talk a little bit more about how we ensure the appropriateness of data sets?
Yeah, great question again. So it depends, right? The first aspect is dealing with bias. Again, every AI ML model itself has got inherent bias. And so as manufacturers, how do you provide documentation to demonstrate that bias was evaluated as part of the risk management process? There's an ISO standard as well on bias for AI and medical devices and IVDs that would be a good reference point. It does speak to some key statistical rationale that you could establish to demonstrate that you basically consider every side of the table there. In terms of some of the laws in the US, I think the EU is taking a harder stance on this, and that's why any AI that is intended for example, social scoring that's included AI. And so there is the need now to let the end users have a good understanding of the process through which a decision is being reached. For example, if you build a simple decision tree model requesting or indicating that individuals in a particular postal code might be more eligible for a new credit card versus those in another postal code, can you, with a strong statistical rationale, demonstrate that to a certain extent, individuals in that particular code are indeed discriminated by the AI model or the ML model? So in terms of demonstrating appropriateness or representativeness, it comes down to simple logic as well as having sound statistical principles as well as rationales to demonstrate that first, the device is safe. Secondly, it's intended to perform as expected.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, there's another bit in the EU AI Act that talks about AI that contradicts EU values. I'm assuming that that falls somewhere in there. Can you shed a little more light on that for us, what that means, particularly for those of us on this side of the ocean?
Yeah, so EU values are basically values around human rights, social services, and all that fancy stuff. So that AI in itself, it's intended to be prohibited, and that is the expectation. And again, if you build AI systems that are intended to discriminate people based on where they live or how they look or where they come from, then that AI system is expected to be prohibited, because that is a contradiction on EU's values.
Gotcha. Understood. Just occurred to me, we've been talking about the EU AI Act a lot, and I haven't asked you a very simple question. What is in the EU AI Act, man? Like, spell it out for us, make it simple. What is it going to require us to do that we haven't done before? If you could give us a quick overview.
Um, I can't. It would be fair on the EU AI Act for me in a 45-minute session like this to give you the spiel. I've been fortunate enough to meet folks who were involved in drafting the initial version of the act back in April 2021, as well as being involved in the amendments. Again, the number of amendments that are coming through now, again, 377 is a strong indication of the evolution in the space. What I would say in the EU AI Act is that there is this particular chapter in a title that lists the different requirements for high risk devices such as medical devices. And the good news there is that some of these requirements, if you meet the state of the art requirements, some of these are already captured in them. And so there's not a heavy lift to basically meet the intents of that regulation. The other good thing with the EU AI Act is it's not contradictory with the other regulations. So it's entirely meant to complement the MDR and the IVDR as well as the GDPR. And so there is specific references to all these other regulations in the EU AI Act.
Thank you, thank you. And then let's switch a little bit back to the United States. So with the executive order that we saw last month, I think the end of last month, what are some of the things that we can expect to see? I know we saw a bunch of guidances from FDA earlier this year. Should we see a lot more? What can we expect to be in those? If you can give us a flavor of that, how it might differ from the EU AI Act, or what, if the different bodies will behave a little bit differently.
Yeah, the expectation is the FDA is going to basically take up on a mantra here and release some guidance documents. It's not new. We knew this was coming. Most of us in the space love the idea of machine learning practices as well as a predetermined change control plan. Again, the FDA is positioning itself to be a leader in the space. In terms of what I expect to be different is the concept of transparency. The fact that end users have to know first that their data has been collected, if the data is being collected by a medical device. Secondly, if they are using that device, they need to know as well, and provided with sufficient information to make an informed decision on whether or not to use that AI in a medical device.
Gotcha. And then I guess, from a more simplistic perspective, you mentioned some of the different guidance about China, US, EU are regulations coming in the EU rather. If you had advice for a manufacturer, say, hey, start doing this today, here are the 3 to 5 things you should start doing today that you probably aren't doing those.
Good question.
Great question.
I would say if you have an AI ML enabled device or you plan to develop one in the future, you should be proactive in your design and development efforts. As the global regulatory framework for these devices, as we've probably learned in the last 30 or so minutes, is rapidly evolving. Long gone are days when manufacturers would expect for their quote unquote black box devices to be certified. All these regulatory regimes now are pushing to know what is in there in terms of transparency and robustness. And if you're a programmer, I thought I was a leader, leading several programmers, and this is a cliche, but software engineers, we hate documented stuff. Sure. But don't be surprised if you have regulatory regimes now asking for you to share your codes with them, just so they can review and make sure that some of the predetermined criteria are met and that the device itself is not compromising patient safety or device performance. So being proactive, being alert for the changes in the space is good. Ensuring that proper documentation throughout the product development cycle, the life cycle, is super important. The fourth thing I would mention is, to the best of your ability, demonstrate good machine learning practices. And the way we see this is because the FDA's concept there has gained popularity amongst other regulatory frameworks. There should be proper segregation of data that is used for training, validation, and testing. And when you start mixing data, and when we talk about 10-fold cross-validation, 5-fold cross-validation, that is as good as it gets. But is there statistical rationale to demonstrate that when you mix the data and use for training and validation, you don't actually overfit, as an example, if there's no inherent bias to the safety and performance of that device?
Awesome. Thank you for especially touching on good machine learning practices. I know it's a new concept for a lot of us as well. I'm coming towards the end of my questions for you. I want to make sure we have time for folks in the audience. George, anything come through from the audience?
Yes, just something just came in now here. I'm going to read it out. Let me know if you need me to reread it. If the business process requires a human to QC the output of the AI algorithm instead of the AI alone, is the risk generally considered lower, and does that have an impact on medical device classification?
Not an impact on device classification. The fact that a human is coming, I would see that as a risk mitigation step. And so all what you've basically asked in that question is related to the risk of misuse, the risk of inherent risk of the device in terms of identifiers. But I don't see a change to the medical device classification per se, because the medical devices are classified based on their intended use. And then part of the EU AI Act is based on the listing. So there shouldn't be a change in the classification there.
Good to know. And then if we could jump back to some of the changes that you mentioned coming out of China, just because of that may be new for some of us as well. Could you give us a quick characterization of what some of those look like? Is that different what we're seeing FDA do, different from what we're seeing in the EU?
Technically, no. I think, again, I like the word convergence, right? Because you expect these regulatory regimes to eventually converge. What China's National Medical Products Administration they're doing is being very proactive, and I see the EU following, and the FDA as well following a similar framework, in which case they will publish a blanket regulation at the IVDR or the MDR, and then over time, based on feedback from different stakeholders, be it manufacturers, the EMO, or notified bodies, they will release other guidance documents. In the case of China, is the National Medical Device Administration. In the case of the EU, the Medical Device Coordination Group. What's in the case of the US, it's going to be the FDA. And so the expectation is that those additional guidance documents now become quote unquote state of the art. And that's why, if you look at China's approach, it's a big confusing for manufacturers, because on average, 1 or 2 new guidance documents in AI ML alone are being released on a monthly basis. And you look at manufacturers who are expected to be designing and optimizing the AI enabled devices, they are not keeping up to with what the regulatory bodies are publishing. So it's important, I would say, to establish a good regulatory framework of involved in this space.
Thank you for that. Last question from me, and then I'll turn it over to some more audience questions. So you mentioned a lot of changes coming through from everywhere. How can people best stay up to date on some of these changes? Because some of the stuff you mentioned has been a surprise for me, and I thought I was knee deep in it.
Well, I was about to say that having these kinds of sessions is great because you could get folks more insight to basically share some of that expertise. Um, Over the last few months, being at RAPS, for example, and talking to other key regulators, it's evident that the changes here, and as manufacturers, we understand that the expectation is even more significant for them because, as I mentioned, it's difficult to basically get to touch with this. So I'm a big fan. I know it's easier said than done of establishing a robust regulatory strategy, having the right experts in the room who are up to date with what's happening, especially with target markets. So, an example, if you use a target market, then you should basically have a regulatory team sign up to the MDCG because they will be publishing guidance documents. Same thing with the FDA. You should sign up to FDA for the latest news. And it's not just that AI and cybersecurity is a huge part of that as well. And so it's important to be aware of the changes that are happening in the space. But women in industry, I do acknowledge how challenging it will be for especially small and medium-sized companies to keep tabs with these changing regulatory frameworks.
Thank you. All right, George, anything else from the audience?
Yes, we have another question here. Regarding the testing and validation of software to be used in pediatric populations, are regulators expecting a higher level of risk management, perhaps a greater or larger set of test conditions?
Yes, pediatric populations, as you would expect, they can defend themselves. And so as regulators, we hold manufacturers to very high regards on the testing that has been done. One of the standards, which is also state of the art, that I didn't mention, is application of usability engineering to medical devices. I might be wrong here, but I think it's 62326-1. And that's usability engineering. So the expectation then is that if your device is intended for pediatric groups, then the risk management process should capture that in addition to all the potential use error risks that might arise from deploying that medical device.
All right. Well, thank you much. I think this is about all the time we have, unless there's another question from the audience.
Nothing as of right now.
All right. If anyone does come in, feel free to interrupt me. Actually, I think I just saw one.
Yes, one just came in. How do you see MedTech companies dealing with governance of AI ML? Is that something that would be owned by the quality or legal or another group?
I could basically put that question over to Khalil because he would be more on the legal side than me. But one of the wrinkles we're facing in the EU now with the EU AI Act is actually informed by MedTech. Of course, MedTech went back to parliamentarians and let them know how challenging it would be to implement some of those things that they've been fighting for the transitional timeline of the proposed 24 months, 36 months, 48 months. So, of course, MedTech have got a significant role to play. In terms of regulations, I think it's a combination of both. Quality, which would play an important role in terms of implementation, and then there's a legal framework as well, which is basically ensuring that those appropriate processes put in place to first interpret what the regulation is, and then ensure that there's sustainable practices in-house to demonstrate intent of safety and performance of this from medical devices that they manufacturing.
Yeah. I think from my perspective, I tend to agree, right? I've seen kind of the genesis of these discussions happening in a couple of different organizations. And the way I see it, it's almost like a 3 or 4-legged stool. One of the things you mentioned earlier, Dr. Fu was talking about the importance of data privacy and cybersecurity and all these as well. If you read through the executive order, it talks a lot about cybersecurity. Some of the same things in both documents talk a lot about protections of personally identifiable information as well. And so what I've seen within organizations is these are topics that have historically resided in legal as far as, coming up with what that policy looks like from a data privacy perspective. It's existed in either information security or cybersecurity organizations as far as how do you protect it. But again, tends to be from a nuts and bolts perspective and not necessarily from a system perspective. Hint, hint. And then over in the quality organizations, we tend to have very robust quality management systems. And so we know how to operate a management system that exists in all levels and all corners of an organization. And so, the quick answer is it depends. The typical quality out is it depends, right? It depends on, I think, what your organization looks like and the strength of your organization. I think for the actual operationalizing of it, that tends to be best handled within a quality organization, just because you've got people in different parts of the organization and you've got mechanisms and processes and training and all of that rigor already baked into your organization versus a legal organization that is going to be great from a policy definition perspective. Specifically, if you're talking about data privacy, that's going to be an area that, that's not necessarily an equality or ISEC wheelhouse, so to speak. But then when you get into some of the nuts and bolts of, hey, where's this data stored? What are the protections that exist around this data? That's going to also reside within a cybersecurity organization. And they may or may not have their own cybersecurity management system in place already. Same thing with the privacy management system. And then another weird wrinkle is, where does this exist within the product? This has always been managed from a cybersecurity perspective as an organization, not necessarily within the product. So that may even be within your R&D folks, or may again fall back to you within quality, simply because there's been cybersecurity guidances that come out. So my long-winded answer for you is it depends, but realistically, I think it requires a collaboration of all these organizations to do it right, because it ultimately crosses a lot of these verticals. And I think if you stay within your verticals, you're going to end up doing it wrong inherently. And that's just what it's going to be. So that's my 2 cents there. All right. Now I'm going to stop talking. All right. So that's pretty much all the time we have. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Ken, for coming and sharing your experience with us. I know we learned a lot about the AI regulatory landscape. We talked a lot about changes coming in the US, the EU, and China. We talked a lot about what organizations should be doing to prepare, different standards they can refer to, and different things that they should be looking out for. Particularly in areas that may not be historically where we've had responsibility in looking out for them. As George mentioned earlier, I think that the recordings will be made available. We will reach back out to you all. We've got all of your emails, so we'll reach back out to you in that same avenue to let you know once they're posted. I believe I saw a note about some references to different
Yes.
and regs.
Yeah, somebody asked about links or guidances, FDA guidance documents, China guidelines, etc. So I think we can add those to the video. But also, reach out to Khalil or I at any time. Go on our website, regulatorygroup.net. You can reach out to us from there, and I'm sure Khalil will speak a little bit more to this about any upcoming further webinars as well.
Awesome. All right, that's all I have. Thank you guys for joining, and have a great day and weekend. For those of you in the US, have a great Thanksgiving holiday next week. Take care.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you both and everyone.
Yep.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.